Like a lot of men in this world, Robert grew up assuming feminists were ugly women nobody wanted to date, and he used his male entitlement with women sexually at times. Yet he then went on to becoming good friends with Andrea Dworkin. He used his academic rigor to write the essay on patriarchal sex in the 1990s, and he did a TEDx talk on how radical feminism is in men's favor. There are so many important points to hear in this episode. So, without further ado, I bring you Robert Jensen, and I really hope the guys are listening in on this one. Welcome, everyone, to this provocative and heartfelt podcast, Beyond Patriarchal Sex, a place for both women and men to elevate ourselves, finding out what it takes to live beyond our conditioning and assumptions, not only for ourselves, but also for the coming generations. My name is Devashi Shakti, and you are warmly welcome to be part of these conversations. Okay, I am really, really happy to be meeting today with Robert Jensen, who I mentioned in episode one. And I want to introduce you, Robert, by saying that you are a retired professor from the School of Journalism and Media at the University of Texas at Austin. And from 1992 to 2018, you taught graduate and undergraduate courses in media law, ethics, and politics. And you have many books. And I saw that the title of your latest book is called It's Debatable, Talking Authentically About Tricky Topics, which seems very apt for today's conversation. And you've done a lot of academic level work on radical feminism. You have a TED Talk, which I will include for our listeners to tune into later. And you wrote the essay on patriarchal sex that I mentioned when this podcast was starting. So these are not flippant ideas for you, are they? They're very well thought through, very heavily researched. You've had a lot of time to distill the essence of your messages around patriarchal sex. So how many years has your attention been on patriarchal sex as a topic?
I was very fortunate when I went back to graduate school. I was 30 years old. It was 1988. And through dumb luck, I stumbled onto the feminist critique of pornography, which was very much an important topic in the discussion of freedom of expression, which was my area of study. That led me to learning about the feminist movement more generally, especially what we tend to call the radical feminist movement. It led me to meet actual feminists. And so a lot of the assumptions I made growing up as a pretty typical guy in modern America had to give way to deeper understandings. So for instance, I used to use as a joke, when I first started reading about this, I knew a lot about feminism. I knew that feminists were ugly women who couldn't get dates. And the reason I joke is because that's the kind of idea I grew up with. So it wasn't until I was 30 years old that I actually engaged these topics in a serious way. And it really turned my life upside down. For me, it was never just an intellectual enterprise or even a political one. It was deeply personal, as it is for most of us who engage these topics. So I just look back and am grateful for the people, mostly women and a few very committed men, who put up with my stupid questions and my idiotic assumptions and helped educate me. And that's why we're talking today, because people, mostly women, were kind to me. And I'll never forget both the individuals and the movement that did that for me.
And how interesting that they were not, in fact, these angry, ugly women who couldn't get dates after all.
I always say the worst stereotype about feminists is that they don't have a sense of humor. And I can testify that is not true. I have never laughed so hard as I've laughed in feminist gatherings. Just as an example, one of my comrades from the feminist anti-pornography movement was here recently to visit, and it was just such a sense of comfort to be with someone with whom you didn't have to argue about whether violent pornography was a good thing or a bad thing. You didn't have to argue whether or not systematic male dominance in our culture was real or not. You didn't have to argue about whether it's really men who have it hard. And it reminded me so much of that environment I was educated in. And the excitement of it, it wasn't just, interesting, it was exciting because I was learning to see the world in a different way. And I've been fortunate to have that happen around many issues. And I'm always grateful.
Yes. So it sounds like the curiosity and connection with people that were interesting and fascinating to you.
Yeah.
Like, what else did it take just inside of your own inner workings to even approach it, to
Yeah.
understand and learn about it?
Yeah. Well, I said I grew up as a pretty typical guy in modern American society, and that's both true and not true. I was also I was always the skinniest, shortest, most effeminate kid in my class. I walked around kind of with a target on my back. I was terrified through most of my childhood. I have my own experience of suffering abuse as a kid. And so even though I was trying my best when I was in my 20s to be a regular guy, I was failing at it. I was unhappy. I couldn't connect to people very well. I had all of the problems that so many men in a patriarchal society have when the key to being a real man is shutting down any complex emotions. So when I hit graduate school at the age of 30 and found a feminist analysis, it spoke to the fact that I really never felt like a real man. And now I didn't have to keep trying to be a real man. I could try and be a human being. And I think that's what originally, although I wouldn't have been able to articulate it at the time, that's what originally drew me in. I've often said that one of the reasons feminism always made sense to me once I learned about it was in a lot of ways as a child, I'd been used in some of the same ways girls are used. And so it wasn't a big stretch to understand what dominance fused with sexuality, power, what that meant. And it was like a whole different world opened up and I could understand myself. Now, of course, the goal was to understand society and to try in political terms to change society for the better. But, everybody's motives are mixed and mine was deeply personal. I needed to understand myself better, and radical feminism, kind of ironically, because of course most men think radical feminism is a threat to them. And so in the TEDx talk you mentioned, the title of that is Radical Feminism is a Gift to Men, Not a Threat. It's a way not only for us to understand the world better and perhaps behave better, it's a way to understand ourselves better. And so I never saw feminism committing to a feminist intellectual and political project as giving anything up. I thought I was gaining everything.
That's a really incredible view. And so I want to get into your work on radical feminism in a moment. But
Mm,
firstly, your younger years, it
mm,
sounded like you experienced misuse of male power and dominance
mhm,
against you. Is
mm.
that right?
Yeah, I come from a wonderfully dysfunctional American family, typical in some ways in gender norms. This is post-World War II, my father was the head of the household. My mother took orders from him. All of the stereotypes of that era were certainly true in my case. And then there were other levels, alcoholism, and the details actually I'm still trying to write about because a lot of them aren't very clear. As you probably know, one of the hallmarks of abuse, especially for children, is dissociation of, mentally separating yourself from what's happening to you. And psychologists would also speak of dissociative amnesia, the inability to remember some of that. And so I'm still struggling even to understand what happened to me as a kid. But it was the kind of growing up that didn't meet any of the typical 1950s happy household stereotypes. It was rife with abuse and misery, really. And when I say that, what I mean is, my parents were the perpetrators of all this, but they were miserable people too. They didn't know how to process their own emotions. And so I think, levels of abuse vary, but it's very common. I'm 66 years old. I was born in 1958. When I speak to contemporaries, it's rare that somebody grew up in a healthy, emotionally healthy household. Again, the levels vary and the levels matter because there's serious abuse and just kind of run-of-the-mill dysfunction. But it's kind of shocking how common it is. And I think that's part of why the dominant culture resists a radical feminist analysis, because it's very hard for the culture to look at it. In the same way, for instance, it's been hard for the culture to look at white supremacy and what racial injustice has really meant in the United States. The truth is brutal, and I think brutal is the appropriate term here. And so it's not surprising that the dominant culture rejects radical feminism, and today not only rejects radical feminism, rejects any suggestion that institutionalized male power shapes the world we live in.
Yes, yes. Gosh, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I'm so sorry you went through that, by the way.
Thank you.
And I understand that it is very common at the same time. And there's obviously very different degrees of abuse, like you said. But would it be fair to say that your parents were experiencing a relationship with patriarchal sex present?
Yeah, that's an understatement. My parents lived out what I would call not the American dream, but kind of the American nightmare. Neither one, both came from households that I think there was significant levels of, verbal, emotional abuse. Neither one of them ever had a chance to form a healthy sense of self. And both of them were accepting the gender norms of their era. Now, my mother eventually rebelled against that. But it was the worst kind of training that a kid could have, is to watch parents, struggle to even know themselves, let alone know how to raise children. And again, there are some specifics about my case that are distinctive, but in some ways, this is the story of my generation. I'm not saying that everything's fine now and this doesn't happen anymore. I'm just speaking of the experience I know quite well from my own life and from the lives of so many of my friends.
Yes, yes. And my emphasis on patriarchal sex through this research and this podcast, which eventually becomes a book, is about really naming how these dynamics play out in the actual physical intimacy. Because while there's many variables around it, there's such a common reality of how that plays out on a sexual intimacy level.
Sure.
And it's so damn normalized and unquestioned. And I thank you so much for the incredible work that you've done to help reveal what has been hidden.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. And the example I used to use with students, if they had trouble understanding how a big social system like patriarchy could affect everyday life, I would say, just think of the concept of sexual assault and our obsession with consent. Now, when I say obsession, I'm not saying consent is a bad thing, of course. But there's a term that I first remember reading years ago that some people call gray rape, where there's there's consent in a sense, but under conditions which mean that consent isn't very meaningful. So I would use this example, which college students could understand. Imagine a young woman goes on a date with a man, ends up back in his apartment or her apartment or wherever, and there's a certain level of aggression on his part, not violence, but the kind of aggression that women often fear for perfectly sensible reasons, because that can ratchet up to real violence very quickly. And so the woman may not want to engage in sexual activity, but fears that if she says no, that escalation will happen quickly, and therefore engages in some level of sexual contact that was not really desired, but is a way of, as one student told me, getting him out of my house. Right? Okay, so that wouldn't meet the legal definition of rape, sexual assault, but it's certainly not a model for healthy sexual interaction that we want to champion. Yes. So, once you start to look at how patriarchy, how institutionalized male dominance, how the way we're trained to make assumptions about power, once you realize how deeply set that is in the culture, then all of a sudden, quick and easy black and white, decisions about what's appropriate or inappropriate, they fade away pretty quickly, and you're left with a terrain that, every woman who's listening to this knows, because they've had to negotiate that terrain. Here's another way I used to say it, and I did it as a kind of a joke, but it was to make a serious point. I would say that there are many types of ways that women are uncomfortable sexually in the presence of men. Everything from cat calls on the street to sexual harassment, to out and out rape, to sexualized murder. I say, let's call that whole spectrum of experiences sexual intrusion, the way that women feel intruded upon by men. And this is, of course, not just heterosexual women. A lesbian walking down the street has the same experience. I said, okay, so I would jokingly say I've done an extensive 10-year longitudinal study with 1,000 respondents, and determined that the percentage of women in this culture who have experienced sexual intrusion is 100%. Okay, the joke was I didn't do that study, because you don't need to do that study. All you need to do is talk to women, and you find that those experiences are normalized, as you pointed out. That's the world we're living in, right?
It is, because that picture you painted for us of what happens going back to that apartment is very consistent with a lot of the responses in the survey. Sure. And I don't need the survey to confirm that after having worked with them for so many years, but explicit responses, not all, but many of them describing exactly that.
Yeah. Now, I want to make one thing very clear. Kind of the poster boy for abuse and rape right now is Harvey Weinstein, a former Hollywood producer who's on trial once again for sexual assault. There's a difference between Harvey Weinstein and some 20-year-old male college student who's too aggressive. I mean, we don't want to paint a picture in which every man is a rapist, because that's a caricature of the feminist argument. The feminists have never argued that every man is a rapist. What feminists have argued is that women walk through the world knowing that every man is a potential rapist. Right? And so if I meet a woman on the street, someone who doesn't know me, that woman would be sensible to treat me as a threat until proven otherwise. And a lot of women walk through the world that way. I can say, well, wait, I'm a really nice guy and I would never do that. Fine, but that's not the point. I don't take it personally that I understand that I'm a potential threat. I didn't choose it, but women didn't choose to walk through the world with that level of heightened awareness to protect themselves. So I think sometimes men take things too personally, in the sense that they think that an analysis of social patterns is a condemnation of them. So I used to say to men about feminism, don't take it personally, but take it very personally. That is, reflect on your own life. And this is what I did when I started reading feminism. I had to reinterpret my entire dating history. I thought I was a nice guy, but were there times when I wasn't such a nice guy? And I'm not suggesting I have some deep, dark past as a rapist. That's not my point. My point is I was socialized to be a man, to have certain expectations. And in my dating life with women, I was sometimes a typically obnoxious guy with the expectations that women were there to meet my needs. Okay, so I do take it personally, but I also recognize this is bigger than any one person.
Yes, yes, that honesty really strikes me as exactly what's needed to enter into this
Yeah,
conversation in a
yeah,
valuable way. Um, because, like you said, you personally are not that man who has those shadows to confront, but there are men, who are not exactly Harvey
mhm,
Weinstein for sure, but they are in a gray area, and
yeah,
they take it as a real affront and an attack on them
yeah,
personally, if they might actually need to reflect on some of
yeah,
their past behavior and realize how coercive they may have
yeah.
been. Yeah.
Let me tell you a quick story. This came up, I won't name names, but I was speaking to people I know well, and I said, we were talking about a particular guy, and I said, the only thing I remember about him, because it's been 35 years since I last saw him, was that he was telling me stories about his college days, and his friend had a girlfriend who got really drunk, and the two of them had sex at the party. And then a line of other men went into that same room and had sex with this guy's girlfriend. And that's what in the vernacular they call running a train. It's basically gang rape, is the more appropriate term. And he told me this story. He was a few years older than me. He saw himself as kind of a role model for me. And he's telling the story without hesitation and chuckling at how silly the girl was. And then he paused, and there was this moment he said, I'm not sure I should be telling you this. So his initial reaction was, this is just part of being a guy and one really fun night. But then he had the capacity to self-reflect and say, oh, here's a teenage boy I'm telling this story to. This might not be the best thing. But it was completely routine. That kind of behavior happens all that time. Men talk about it like that. And if you knew this guy, you wouldn't have pegged him as a rapist. You wouldn't have pegged him as he was sensitive. He was a musician. All of the things that are supposed to say I'm different. But in the end, he wasn't. And I was too young to even know what I was being told. It wasn't until years later that I realized this guy confessed to being part of a gang rape to me, and I didn't even understand it as an
Yeah.
18-year-old kid. I tell that story just because that's the world I was raised in, and I think in some ways that world has changed. Certainly, nobody would brag about running a train in the same way they did back then, but it still happens, and in private, men still laugh about it and refuse to hold each other accountable. So
Yes.
I know this is starting to sound very grim, but I think you can't move into a healthier way of interacting sexually, emotionally, until you recognize the training you had. And that's the training I had. And it took a lot of work and a lot of help from other people to break that training.
Yes. So when it's like that's the water that you're swimming in without even
Hmm.
realizing that
Yeah,
it's water, this
yeah,
is the context, the patriarchal context.
yeah,
In that very scenario you described, what your friend said to you, probably all or a lot of those guys that were involved in that are good people. They're
sure.
not bad men. But in the context that is greatly unquestioned, it was
Yeah,
normalized to do that
yeah,
behavior.
yeah,
If something else were normalized in the context of the
yeah,
culture, they would have gone along with that. So this is not about demonizing the people. It's more
yeah,
about unveiling and naming very clearly what the
yeah.
context everyone operating in has been. Yeah.
Yeah. And I often use analogies between race and the sex gender system, not because they're exactly the same phenomenon, but I think it's interesting. I grew up with a lot of the same messages racially, you know, uh, not, I didn't belong to the Klan. Nobody around me did, but there was a lot of not too thinly veiled racism where I grew up in the state of North Dakota. Uh, there was, both kind of old style racism. I heard that from my father, but there was kind of liberal racism too, assumptions about, white people being, let's face it, better and should be benevolent to others. There was all that going on. And I absorbed that. And it, again, wasn't until I was in my 30s that I started to critically self-reflect about things I had said to people or done that were not racist in the sense of the harshest, most overt white supremacist behavior. But they certainly were based on an assumption of white supremacy. And
Yes.
I think what's interesting is the American culture, of course, is backsliding on race a lot these days too. But there are still certain things no one would ever say about race. Even very reactionary people wouldn't say in public. And yet we still hear it said about women. So I think I'm not saying that the racial environment in the United States is, you know, uh, doing well, but I think it's a reminder that uh, it's even more difficult, in my opinion, based on my experience, even more difficult for people to come to terms with the sex gender system than with the racial system.
Yes, I agree. And thank you for drawing that parallel because it is an incredibly similar dynamic. And we all
Mm,
know how much stronger racism used to be in the
mm,
past, how
yeah,
normalized and accepted that was. And it
yeah,
has become less and less so. And it's not at a great place, like you said, but
yeah,
it's less and less. The
yeah,
self-awareness in people to not contribute to that, it's
yeah,
never been better in that sense.
yeah,
However, yes, it is much more difficult, it seems, for people to see it in this
yeah.
context.
Let me give you an example out of the work on pornography. So I began that research in 1988. This is, of course, before VHS, home video, before the internet. And and the women who made those initial analytic breakthroughs, I'm thinking especially of Andrea Dworkin, a radical feminist writer in the US who is probably most associated with the feminist critique of pornography. Sadly, Andrea died in 2005, and it was a real loss because she had a brilliant way of analyzing and had deep insights into the culture. So when you think of things like old style Playboy magazines and the really rather tame, by comparison, X-rated films, Andrea and her comrades were analyzing those films to bring out the male dominance, the way that the sexuality in that pornography was based on an assumption of male power and male dominance, and women, serving men's needs sexually. Well, the nature of those images, the overt violence, the cruelty and degradation to women, and also the racism, which is also an important part of it, it's 100 times more intense today than it was. So if have made so much progress, in understanding the sex gender system, why is the world flooded with graphic sexually explicit material, easily available even to children, that is routinely cruel and degrading to women, that glorifies violence against women, that often is actually just filmed rape, and even when it isn't, depicts that dynamic? Well, if we've made so much progress, why are we flooded with this material? And I think it's a reminder of how deep patriarchy, that is, men's assumption of entitlement and women's training to accommodate men, how deeply that goes. And once you understand that, then you realize it's not just a question of pornography. It's a question of how we were all trained to relate to each other and whether we have the, I'm going to say, the courage to look at it honestly. And it does take courage, I think.
It's
When
a
people ask me about my experience, I say the first 5 to 10 years of this, journey of mine were incredibly painful on a regular basis. I had to reassess all my relationships. I had to ask, who am I really? I had to ask, where did my sexual desires come from? And instead of glib answers, I had to look in the mirror. And looking in the mirror is often not very pleasant, especially when you get to be my age. But
if you are a woman who wants to live beyond patriarchal sex, you're going to love the Tigress Path. It's primal feminine spirituality with deep somatic teachings and female embodiment practice. Currently, we have classes online and in person. There's the annual Tigress Bali retreat and more. So reach out on social media or go to thetigresspath.com for details.
All right, no more jokes about aging and appearance. But that's the task in front of us. It's not easy, and I understand why people turn away from it. But I think the more we talk about it, and not just how hard it is, but how rewarding it is, and eventually, I used to not want to talk much about myself in public, but I was convinced by people that if men don't hear anybody saying, listen, it's worth the struggle, why would they engage in it? So I not only point out the pain and difficulty of coming to terms with my own training, but then to remember that on the other side of that, there's an incredible reward. And the reward is simply deeper, richer relationships, not just with women, but also with men. I have male friends now that I could not have connected to in the way I do 30, 40 years ago. It just wouldn't have been possible for me. Emotionally, I would have not had the capacity. So this is about sexuality and relationships, but not just heterosexual ones. Of course, this is relevant to gay men. My own history is bisexual, and so I know this from direct experience, but it's about intimate relationships for gay men. It's about relationships between straight men as friends. It's just a demand to rethink the way we were raised, which isn't easy, but is immensely rewarding. And one more quick footnote, and then I'll be quiet. When I say on the other side, I don't mean that this is a process that you finish and then everything is fine. I still, to this day, struggle with, my training. Images will come to mind. I can still remember images from not only pornography that I watched as a kid, but mainstream movies, kind of pseudo rape scenes in Hollywood movies that I thought were really cool when I was a kid. And they'll come to me and I'll think, wow, that's still part of my consciousness. That's still part of my thinking. And so it's like any other, effort worth doing. It's not something you complete, the 7 easy steps to transforming yourself and then you're done. It's an ongoing struggle, but again, it makes for a deeper, richer experience with everybody in my life. And I mean that across the board. There's not a single relationship in my life that isn't been dramatically changed because I've gone through this feminist critique.
Wow, that is so profound. Thank you for saying that. And I feel like in your TEDx talk, you leave it on such an aspirational note of why radical feminism is in favor of men. It's not against them. It's not attacking them.
Yeah.
I'm aware of what else is there, behind the patriarchal context.
Yeah. I often quote a particular speech Andrea Dworkin gave in, I think it was 1984. Every time this happens a lot. When I talk about Andrea, there's always a moment when her loss hits me, because she was not only for me, but for many, many people, a huge part of a discovery process. Andrea was brilliant, and I often think I'm not sure who I would be if I'd never read Andrea Dworkin. She was that powerful, one of probably a handful of writers in my life who have changed the way I think about the world in a dramatic way. But Andrea in the 1980s was speaking to a pro-feminist men's group. And she said, this idea that we hate you is really quite silly. She said, of course we love you against all the evidence, she said. And that's really, when I read that, I thought, that is really true. If you want to talk about people who have faith in men, it's feminists. Right? They keep engaging on the belief that men can change. And that's an expression of incredible hope, because often the evidence is not powerful for men's willingness or ability to change. And so, that aspiration really comes directly from Andrea and a few close male friends who were part of the feminist movement who gave me a model. And that's why I talk about this. Who wants to hear an old guy talk about his emotional struggles? Well, it was one particular old guy, a man 25 years older than me, who I met during this period. Sadly, we lost him about 10, 12 years ago. But he talked openly about his struggle. And there was a real living, breathing man I could say, oh, I want to be like Jim. And Jim was another one of those people who was a huge influence in my life. After he died, I wrote a book about him because it was that profound. So these inspirations come from a lot of different sources. They come from intellectual work, from political work, and just from human relationships where people decide that they are going to open up and be vulnerable with each other. And watching Jim Coplin be vulnerable with me changed my life. Because up until that time, I had never, and I mean this literally, I had never met a man who knew how to be emotionally vulnerable in my presence. And I was 30 years old. And there's something joyous about that. I found him, and it led to many other relationships. Many mutual friends of Jim's still communicate. I have a biweekly Zoom with two of his other friends, older men. We get together and share over Zoom every 2 weeks. But there's also something sad that it wasn't until I was 30 years old that I had an honest conversation with a man about what I really felt.
Wow.
And that's profound. And it's both sad and I'm eternally grateful I finally found that. But that's what men are struggling with. And I always say that once you get past the bravado, even the most masculine men, the guy that was a high school football quarterback, or, the tough guy, or the richest guy in business, the people who seem to be real men in that caricature, even they are struggling. I've never met a man who thought he was man enough. And that is the particular pathology emotionally and psychologically that patriarchy plays on men, that we're never man enough. I in one of my books, I write about the masculinity that I was raised in was what I call King of the Hill masculinity. King of the Hill is a game we played as kids where you would, try and take the hill and then everybody would try and pull you down. And I thought that's a great metaphor for the masculinity I was presented with. You want to be king. You want to be in charge. You want to be the top dog. You want to be the strongest guy on the team and the most successful guy in business. But the problem with that is there's always somebody coming for you. In King of the Hill, there's always somebody coming to take the king down. And that's that competitive, hyper-competitive, aggressive masculinity, so that even the toughest guys know they aren't really man enough, and that they are always subject to being challenged, to being dragged down. It's no way to live. I mean, there's no way for human beings to live.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly isolating and very lonely. And even if there are others up there on their top of the hill, very competitive constantly, and so no real intimacy.
Yeah. Let me tell you another story. If not to interrupt, but I just remember I had a lot of students who were very honest with me, and it helped me understand younger people. But this female student I had was telling me about social interaction in her dorm, and she said it's so weird when we get together, when women get together, we talk to each other. She said, I've noticed that when guys get together, they play video games and talk to each other by looking at the screen. That's the space in which they feel like they can talk. When they're not directly vulnerable with each other, they're playing a game often a violent video game, and they can talk because they're not exposing themselves. And she said, I finally realized this is really weird. When I talk to a female friend, she said, I sit and look at the person and we talk. And she said, I've noticed this. And she was sad about it because she had male friends. And she said, it makes me sad that they can't just talk to each other. They're doing it through this mediated video game environment. So that's just one example. And again, I'm not saying every guy is emotionally stunted who can't either, understand or articulate their own feelings. That's of course not the case. I'm just talking about how I was raised, what I experienced, and what it took me to break through that.
Yes, yes. And the intimacy that you have demonstrated, the tenderness and the tears coming in your eyes when you talk about these truly intimate, rich friendships and human connections that you've been able to feel and develop with people beyond the patriarchal context running you
Yeah,
it just seems like such a richness, enrichment of life that men are missing out on if
yeah,
not allowing that investigation and this exploration.
yeah,
And like you said, it's definitely beyond heterosexuality, and even into relationship with self and our own bodies, right?
mm,
So self-pleasuring, masturbation, that can be patriarchal too, because it can be running that
yeah,
same template
yeah,
instead of being truly intimate with self.
yeah, yeah. This is how old I am. At when I was young, one of the forms of pornography, there were magazines, there were full-length movies, but there were video loops that you would access by going into a pornographic bookstore and paying, I don't know, 50 cents or a dollar or whatever. And they called them loops. They were short, I don't know, maybe a few minutes. Uh, and and I used to say, a lot of us who grew up in that environment have a pornographic loop playing in our head. And even when we're with a partner or by ourselves, that loop is still there. And I thought that was mostly metaphorical, but as pornography became more and more common, I had more and more young men tell me, and I still remember the first time a man told me this after a lecture I'd given. He said, I can't have sex with my girlfriend without thinking about pornography. And I thought, my God, that I was grateful for his honesty, but there was something so sad about that. Now, my guess is this was not a great interaction for his girlfriend either. But he was self-aware that he had watched so much pornography growing up, and it had so shaped his sexual imagination that a real life sexual interaction uh, needed the kind of boost of the pornographic imagination for him to engage. And as the internet became more and more common as the main distribution system for pornography, that became much more common, up until the point now where there's a generation of men who struggle with what they sometimes call porn-induced erectile dysfunction.
Yes.
Young men who are healthy and have no physical problems, but are unable to perform sexually without pornography. How anybody can think that's, a healthy situation
Exactly.
is beyond me. And of course, the porn industry pretends none of this is real. But therapists, men themselves in support groups are increasingly talking about how they have become chained to that pornographic image to activate their own capacity for sexuality. So,
Yes. And I really want to ask you some specific questions around definitions while we have you here. But firstly, I
sure.
want to bring our listeners into the awareness that this is not about a solution where men are walking on eggshells and never being able to activate healthy male aggression energy. It's not about that. It is there's something for both men and women on a heterosexual level
Mm,
to calibrate and to understand and develop in themselves. And I spend a lot of time, Robert, with women and have for many,
mhm,
many years looking at how we perpetuate our own suffering, actually, and dismantling patriarchy inside of us so we can return to our original nature, if I say it like that. And so we contribute in a different way, but just as much as men
mm,
to or can in upholding patriarchal structures in
Sure.
interpersonal relationships. So my angle in this, because I'm not an academic, I'm not coming from a political position primarily, my
Hmm.
background is in human sexuality and primal feminine spirituality, erotic work, tantric work. So I have a particular view in this that is not diminishing the importance of um, sex education or connection to sexual energy, how we're doing it though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me give you another. I used to do a lot of public speaking about the work on pornography, and I learned a lot from the reactions. And after one event, a woman came up to me and said, I'm pretty sure my son is using pornography regularly. This was quite a while ago when that was still, now I think parents all assume their kids are using pornography. But she said, I'm really worried. And I said, lots of reasons to be worried. I said, in addition to you talking to your son, I said, she was in a heterosexual marriage. I said, it's really important, I think, for your husband to also talk to him and to model a different way of being in the world. And she stopped and she looked very distraught. And I realized, oh, she doesn't trust her husband either. And the conversation kind of trailed off, and I didn't press it because it wasn't my place to force it. But in that instant, I knew, oh, it's not only her fear of her son, it's her fear of what her husband's doing. And she didn't know how to engage that. And there's a good chance she probably never did challenge him. I don't know. But certainly your point is well taken. Women often accept conditions that they don't want out of, staying in a relationship. Relationships are hard, and we've all done things to stay in relationships at various points in our lives that we probably shouldn't have. But I think the pattern is clear here. Women's acceptance of a kind of patriarchal model for sexual interaction with partners, often because there just doesn't seem to be another option. I can tell one more story about a student. A student came into my office and she wanted to talk to me about this subject. And I said, sure. And she said, I read some of your stuff and I think you're just from a different generation. We're younger now and we don't have a problem with porn. It's no big deal. And I said, really? I said, okay, so let me give you a hypothetical. She was heterosexual. I said, imagine there are two men and they're both kind of equally interesting to you. They're both attractive in the same way, whatever that means to you. They're both funny, smart, whatever you value in a potential partner, they're equivalent. So you basically got the same guy. I said, there's only one difference. One is a regular user of pornography and one never uses pornography. Which one would you want to date? And she said, well, the guy who doesn't use porn, of course. And I said, wait, you just told me that porn is no big deal and you don't care about it. But, her immediate reaction was, yeah, of course, I'd love to date somebody who doesn't use porn. But I had a lot of young women say, I don't even bother asking because all the guys in my social circle use porn and there's no sense holding out, for somebody who doesn't. Well, those are the real world conditions under which women operate. And I'm not critical of the choices women make. It's not my place to tell women how to behave. But it's hard not to be sad about those realities, I think.
Yeah, the desensitization is
Yeah,
real. And especially in the young people today, it's really, really concerning. And my motivation with this research, with this platform, this podcast, it is for us as
yeah,
adults, very much like truly for the coming generations,
yeah,
because it's looking pretty bleak, if we can't
yeah,
if we can't explore this,
yeah,
what is going to be their reality actually? Because it's already so extreme for them.
yeah. I have a good friend who works in Australia named Linda Tankard-Reist. She's part of a group called Collective Shout. And I recommend people to go and look at their work. They do great stuff both in traditional, analytical ways, but also on social media trying to reach kids. And she does a lot of talks, not with college students, but with high school and I think even younger students. Schools bring her in. And she gets it firsthand from girls who from middle school on put up with a kind of constant barrage of harassment, often very sexualized, from boys who aren't, you know, pathological criminals. They're just being socialized in a pornographic world where it's all around them. And some of the stories Melinda and her colleagues tell are really disheartening about how routine this is. Now, the good news is she and her colleagues are doing great work, and schools are eager to have them in, and they make a real difference in the lives of young people. But that work is so necessary is, again, one of those things that's hard not to be sad about.
Absolutely. I would love to connect with her and bring her on the podcast as
Oh,
well.
she's wonderful. And Caitlin Roper, shout out to all the women at Collective Shout. I've learned so much from them. I was able to go to Australia, and it was just inspiring to be in their presence. And again, you almost apologetically said you're not an academic, and my reaction was good for you. Not because I haven't learned things from academics, of course, but because there is a way in which academic work can sometimes take the life, the passion, the importance out of subjects and turn them into dry research topics. And the folks at Collective Shout are in the trenches. They're very scholarly in the sense that they're collecting data, right? They're talking to women and recording stories, and that's all important as much, and I would say more so than traditional academic work. Again, I hope none of my professor friends take offense, but we all know that that's true.
Thank you for sharing that. And a book I'm reading at the moment is by Laura Bates, her latest book. I don't know if you've heard of her work,
No.
but she's prolific in what she has to share around what the reality of what's happening with adults, with kids, and with her speaking up very clearly and very articulately about the new sexism. The level of attack that she receives personally for speaking up is outrageous. The death threats, the deep fake AIs, the things that look so real, it's so insulting to her. Like, it just sounds like a very volatile time to be bringing up this subject.
Yeah. I often think of the media environment I grew up in the 1960s and 70s, which was hard enough. And being a kid, especially a kind of odd kid, was hard enough. I don't know that I would, and I'm not being glib when I say this, I don't know that I would have survived if I was the same kid I was growing up in today's environment. I think the opportunities that would have crushed my spirit would have been daily. It wasn't easy growing up when I was a kid. In some ways, things are better. Acceptance of gay lesbian kids, for instance, in a lot of places. But the pressure, the social media, the pornographic nature of so much of that social media, the ease with which people can target other folks anonymously, it's all part of the same problem. Now, can I say one more thing? Because I can just hear people saying, I'm not like that, my kid's not like that, my school isn't like that. When we talk like this, we're not saying every individual has the same experience, every individual behaves the same way. We're talking about patterns. And that's all we ever do in social analysis. We look for patterns, and the patterns are undeniable. So even if, let's say, you're a boy or a girl who's never had any of these experiences, never seen pornography, never been bullied, never been abused, okay, that's great. I'm grateful that you haven't had that experience. But look around at the pattern in the society that you're part of. And if we truly do care about each other, then we have to understand that even if we have not been touched directly by these problems, everybody around us has. And we owe each other a kind of collective struggle on this.
Truly, truly. And the intense opposition that can come from being someone who speaks up really does seem to me like an admission of guilt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's an old joke that if the most homophobic guy in any group is probably the person struggling the most with homoerotic desires. And that's certainly true, that And I don't want to say that people don't have intellectual arguments against my position. I've had debates with people about pornography, and I'm not saying everybody on the other side is some, closeted porn addict dealing with a stunted emotional life. But it's hard not to see that at times. I've certainly seen men react very angrily to, let's say, a public lecture I gave, and after a few times I realized I'm not mad at this guy. I feel sorry for this guy. He's hurting. He's been presented with a way to rethink his own sexual life, and it's painful. And all he knows how to do is lash out and tell me that I'm a prudish, bigot or whatever. And I can take that. That's easy. But the real suffering is not on my part. It's on his part. And so I've tried to learn to be. I think this is also just comes with aging, I hope. Tried to learn to be kinder when people disagree with me, especially if they disagree in a way that's really inappropriate, angry and laden with insults.
Yeah.
Often my first question is, what are they going through? Now, I'm not saying women have an obligation to put up with every abusive man and ask, how is he hurting? The first, and I think without question most important task for women is to ask, how do I be safe and create a world in which I live with as little fear as possible? How do I bond with women in solidarity? And I'm saying the obligation for me, I think, is to try to understand men, because I don't face the same threats women face from men who are angry and unable to process a critique of their own behavior.
I'm personally here for the substance of this work and the research project, not for the likes. But if you want to see interesting and prominent speakers become part of this research, there are two things that you could do right now to help make that happen. First one is to follow the Tigress Path on Instagram or Spotify, and to leave a 5-star rating with a review if you can on Apple. These two things genuinely help so much to get this podcast and research on the radar of those who can help expand the conversation wider. And may we all be free from suffering. I 100% agree, because also my background is in somatic trauma therapy, and I have deeply worked with men as well as women. So I really understand that.
Yeah.
Wanted to ask you the level of pushback, resistance that you received when you were bringing this forward, because the level that, say, Laura Bates is getting, those wounded men that are genuinely hurting, and that's really how I see it, are, however, a lot of them, not just some, sending her graphic images of all the types of heads that they want to use to cut her up with. And she has to have security surveillance at her home.
Yeah. I've worked for my entire career with a woman named Gail Dines, one of my best and oldest friends. And Gail now runs a nonprofit group called Culture Reframed that has great educational material, especially for parents and kids. So Gail and I have been doing the same work for the same amount of time. We're about the same age. We were both academics for a long time. And whatever, verbal abuse I put up with, whatever hateful emails I would occasionally get, Gail got 100 times worse, right? And that was always important for me to acknowledge, that whatever kind of pushback I get, it's nothing like what women get. And of course, the pushback against women is often sexualized, almost entirely sexualized, and often comes with real threats you have to worry about. I always say, if somebody sends me an email saying you're an idiot and I'd like to punch you in the nose, I don't worry much. Nobody's ever come and found me and punched me in the nose. But of course, women deal with a very different threat level and have to take it more seriously. So you're absolutely right. And that's one of the reasons, and this has been made by a lot of men in feminism, that it's so important for us to stand up and challenge men, not because we know better than women, but because women are often not in a position to do that. And so the first job of men is, to work on ourselves, but it's also to challenge each other and to provide some cover for women who are at much greater risk than we are. And I also don't want to underestimate the risks that men face. I mean, men are sexually assaulted. There's all sorts of awful things that can happen to men, but it's the pattern we're talking about. The routine way in which women are the subject of sexualized threats and the potential for real violence.
Exactly. Thank you so much for saying that. And women are getting that for speaking up and
Mm.
speaking up, just simply naming the patterns that are in the
Yeah,
environment. They're not harming anyone. They're not
yeah,
saying that men are terrible. They're simply reporting what are the patterns in the environment that we're living in. That is it. That's all they're saying.
yeah. In the domestic violence world, it's kind of a truism now that women are at most risk from violence from a partner when they leave. That and in a sense, what made me think of that is they've named the pattern for themselves. They understand they have to leave the relationship because the pattern isn't changing, and that's when they are most at risk. And that's when women leave or try to leave that you see violence and even murder so often. Uh, and that is not easy to do. It's not easy to first identify the pattern for women to do that and then to name it because of the threat that's all around. And a lot of this is also from my conversations with women over the years, people just want to be normal. They just want to have a life. Uh, when you start to see the way patriarchy plays out in everyday life, especially in relationships, it's a real burden in a way because you're constantly aware of and trying to negotiate how to change, yourself, how to change your relationships. When I was first teaching, all the feminist colleagues I had talked a lot about this. They say we are helping young women understand how they are sexualized, objectified, pornographized in the world. But once we do that, it's like, a permanent sense of rage. I had one young woman say, I can't look at a billboard, I can't look at a magazine, I can't watch a TV show without becoming enraged at how women are objectified. Right? Now, one hopes that isn't a permanent state of being. Living at that level of rage is really hard. But it's part of the struggle is you want people to be aware of the pattern, but being aware of the pattern then comes with a cost of its own. And we just hope it leads eventually to a better life individually and of course a better society.
Yes. And I think how I get to not go into that rage personally and run that through my nervous system constantly is because I'm very focused on what is beyond patriarchal sex.
Yeah,
My work is entirely focused on that and the
yeah,
level of cultivation of desire and inner development as a woman. So I'm not just looking out at what is wrong and what
yeah,
people are doing. It's
yeah,
beyond that as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But that rage is part of the process, I think, for most of us. As I became aware of certain people who had been abusive to me when I was young, I went through a period of, wishing them dead and fantasizing about killing people. I'm not a violent person. The last time I was in a fight, I was, I think, 8 years old. I'm the antithesis of a tough guy. But I say that just to acknowledge that our internal lives, when we confront these experiences and these patterns, can be really messy. It leads to thoughts and anger, and often then we direct that at ourselves. And so, if not for a good therapist, I'm not sure where I'd be right now. But it's a complex and messy business. And the reason I say that is often when I talk about what I've written or the work I've done, it's easy to make it sound like this nice, seamless process. Identify problem, self-reflect about problem, engage in new types of relationships, change the world. Life is not like that. Life is messy, painful, and often we are afraid not just of other people, but afraid of ourselves and how we react. Uh,
Yes,
because
and
when you,
anger is so complex, isn't it?
yeah,
And it's both destructive and creative,
yeah,
And I know that there are women that tend to seek me out for one-on-one support because they know or they've
yeah,
heard that I
yeah.
have a real allyship with the vibration, with the frequency of anger. Like I have a lot of
Oh yeah,
respect for it.
yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
Robert, I know that there are people who would like me to not call this patriarchal sex. So while we have you, please enlighten everyone. Why is
Well,
the term patriarchy not, in fact, outdated?
well, you know, first of all, we have to disabuse people of the notion that human societies have always been patriarchal for hundreds of thousands of years. That's not accurate. Patriarchy, as a name for a social system of what I would say is institutionalized male dominance. That's only, depending on how you look at the histories, maybe 7,000 years old. It comes from a certain period of civilization building, the invention of agriculture. We could do a whole long discussion of history. But patriarchy as a system is only a few thousand years old out of the 300,000 years of Homo sapien history. So it's a fairly recent phenomenon, but it's one that's set very deeply, right? And when one says patriarchy, one isn't saying it's static or the same in every society. So I would say that Saudi Arabia is a patriarchal society, and I would say the modern United States is a patriarchal society, but they're very different. And the US has changed, some for the better, some for the worse, in ways, since feminism emerged in the 1960s again. So patriarchy is just a system built on certain assumptions about who has a right to rule, right? Now, again, you can have perfectly, liberal men who espouse feminist values, who in their everyday lives still operate in very patriarchal ways. Probably the most common way you read about this is a dual career couple, a man and a woman, heterosexual marriage, both working. Who does the majority of the housework? Well, studies and personal experience demonstrate it's typically women. Well, why is that? Well, that's the outgrowth of patriarchy, the assumption that that kind of work is women's work, that men's work is more important, that men's leisure time is more important. So we're not just talking about, some caricature of a patriarch, that is the head of a family who holds the whip over all the women in the family. We're talking about the subtle ways that men are socialized to assume entitlement and domination, and women are often socialized to accept it. I think, the fact that we cannot turn away from is the common reality about sexual assault. And as I said earlier, more generally, sexual intrusion. A patriarchal society is one in which men are not routinely punished for using women sexually in ways they want, even if it's against the will of a woman. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't laws against rape. It doesn't mean those laws haven't been improved over the years. It means the vast majority of sexual assault is never reported, and the vast majority of sexual assault that is reported is never really punished. That's a patriarchal society, right? Uh, you know, let me talk about our political leadership. When Donald Trump was elected, I happened to be in the middle of a unit on pornography in a class, and I thought, well, given the revelations about Donald Trump's sexually predatory behavior, I couldn't, ignore it. So I came in after the election and I said, listen, everybody wants me to talk about this, so here's what I'm going to tell you. The man we just elected president of the United States is an acknowledged sexual predator by the testimony of many women and by his own testimony. And you live in a society in which a sexual predator can be elected president. And then I said, now, when I say that, people often say, well, what about Bill Clinton? He was just as bad. Well, whether he was just as bad or not, I don't know. But it's true that Bill Clinton had credible claims of sexual harassment and even rape against him, and that his personal life, I think, fits the term sexual predator. And I said, now, you have to understand, Bill Clinton is a senior statesman in the Democratic Party. So you have one party that just elected an acknowledged sexual predator and another party that still honors an acknowledged sexual predator. I said, that's the world we live in. Right? It's not taking sides politically. It's just recognizing that's a patriarchal society. And it doesn't mean that sexual assault is the only problem women face, obviously. But it's the one where you see, I think, a distillation of men's sense of entitlement and men's sense of impunity. And again, Rape laws have been improved. Prosecutions are better than they used to be. The Me Too movement is an example of how activism can change things. But we're a long way from anything that you could even remotely call a sexually healthy culture.
That is absolutely true. Thank you for sharing that. And coming towards the end here, I want to make sure I get to ask you this question. You actually posed this question yourself. What a healthy, what does a healthy non-patriarchal male sexuality look like? And you've been sharing that today, if our listeners read between the lines, but what more could you answer to that one?
Well, that's going to be very different for different people because there's just, a lot of individual variation in the human species. But I wrote an article that was published in the late 1990s called Patriarchal Sex. And I think, I haven't read it in a while, but I think, and my aging memory may not be good here, but one of the things I wrote in that article was that the primary rule in patriarchal sex is you got to get it. You got to have it. There's this compulsion to always be hypersexual. And bisexual, I mean traditional notions of genital sex. And I think the first thing I would say is it's possible to be a real live, living, breathing, emotionally healthy human being and not constantly be seeking sexual activity, not only in general, but even in relationships. That most of the joy in a sexual relationship is the intimacy which depends on vulnerability. And you can't put yourself in a vulnerable place if you come in with a preset idea of what great sex looks like. You have to be open to the complexity of it. And so I think as I've aged and changed myself, that's the most important thing I've realized. We reduce, I've said before and written before that one of the terms I really hate is hot sex. Who's hot, right? Heat is produced by friction, and sexual talk is often about heat. And I've suggested that maybe if we used a language of light, that the real joy of sexuality isn't the heat produced by the friction of hot chicks and hot guys having hot sex, but it's the light that we can shine on each other. And I think in my most profound sexual experiences, when I've been most vulnerable, it's allowed me to see another human being, a partner, more deeply. I can shine a light into that person. And I can also shine that light into myself and be seen. And, that sounds perhaps a little idealistic, but a lot of our sexual lives are complex. Sometimes sex is just pleasure. It's just a kind of routine way of connecting with someone and feeling good. But often in our most profound sexual moments, it's because we see each other in new ways. And that requires vulnerability. And an obsession with always getting it and always having hot sex doesn't lead to maximum vulnerability.
Yes.
And especially for men. Women have their own struggles, but for men who are taught from a very early age to never be vulnerable, not to other guys, not to women, that's a real heavy lift. And I'm still working on how to make sure I don't shut down and how do I remain vulnerable, because it takes effort and it's potentially painful. If you're vulnerable with another person, you open yourself up not only to great joy, but pain. But that's the human condition. We don't really have any way around it. And so I think about sex in terms of light instead of heat, not to again paint some, overly romantic, idealized notion, but to keep striving for a deeper sense of connection to people. And in the end, it is, it's a cliche, it's pop songs. All you need is love. The only thing that really matters in the world is that connection. Once our basic needs, it's nice to have a house and to eat regularly. But when your basic needs are met, it's pretty clear that which brings joy is human connection. And connection to animals. I see you with your cats and my dogs. I don't want to downplay how important connections to animals can be as well, and to the larger living world, to being connected to life, not just human life, but all the life around us.
Yes, reconnection to life itself. and the
Yeah.
joy of that and the richness of sexual intimacy that can come
Yeah.
with intimacy as well, and what
Yeah.
that opens in your life, what it has opened in your life, in my life,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
everyone's lives, if they have the courage
Yeah.
to make peace with this process of becoming more and more vulnerable. And it never really ends, does it?
No, no. And there's always, I happen to be married now in a relationship that will continue till I'm gone, I hope. Uh, and after 20 years, you kind of start to think, well, I know everything there is to know about this person. And then there are these magic moments where something happens and somebody's more vulnerable and you share something you didn't know. And it, the struggle is ongoing, but the joy is ongoing as well. And there's always new ways to experience that joy. And it's probably good to end on an upbeat notion, not to discount how painful it can be, but not to forget how joyful it can be as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm really touched
Uh,
by the level of personal sharing today as well.
oh,
Thank you so
oh,
much for the work that you've been doing for so many years. And I
oh.
hope you're thoroughly enjoying your retirement at this point.
Well, I'm still busy writing, but it's nice not to have to go to the office. And if I may say one last thing to reinforce, I'm happy when people read my books or my articles. A lot of them are available for free online, including my book on pornography. But it's really the work of women from whom I learned that I hope people will go back to. And I mentioned Andrea Dworkin; she's just one of many. But Andrea Dworkin's work is getting a bit more interest these days. They've republished some books. And I would really suggest, before anybody reads a book of mine, please go read something by Andrea Dworkin. She's a powerful writer, was an amazing person, and deserves the attention.
Well, I will be putting links to those
Great.
free essays with the episode show notes here. And thank you for bringing in Andrea to my awareness. I will include some links about her as well. I do wish I got to meet her. I really do.
Yes.
But I'm thankful you got to bring the spirit of her and
Yeah.
your other friend that you mentioned as well into this conversation through you. Yes.
Great.
Thank you,
It's been
Robert.
a real pleasure to speak. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, please do share it around on social media. And know that everyone is invited to be part of our research in the anonymous survey. Your contribution will help reveal the exact ways men and women can live beyond patriarchal sex and find greater harmony together. You can find the link to our survey and also details on the Tigress Path for Women via thetigresspath.com.